The cafe was the kind of place where the clink of porcelain cups and the low hum of conversation felt rehearsed, as if even the air itself knew it had to keep up appearances. Sunlight spilled in through tall glass windows, catching on polished silverware and dancing across the marble floor. A steady rhythm of footsteps, espresso machines, and muted laughter created the illusion of warmth. But at the corner table, warmth didn't exist. Isabella sat alone, her wheelchair positioned neatly against the edge of the table as if someone had carefully arranged it there and then forgotten her. She was dressed impeccably, cream silk blouse, tailored skirt, a soft cashmere scarf that framed her face. The kind of outfit that spoke of money, privilege, and yet, somehow, isolation. Her long hair fell over one shoulder, perfectly brushed. Though she hadn't really cared this morning, she had dressed out of habit, not hope. In front of her sat a single cupcake, small enough to be forgotten on the vast white plate. A swirl of pale pink frosting held one unlit candle. The candle leaned slightly, like even it had given up standing tall. She hadn't touched it. Her fingers rested in her lap, nails painted a muted rose. She looked at the cupcake as though it might say something to her, but it remained silent, an edible monument to the truth she tried not to think about. No one was coming. The staff stole glances her way, their eyes flicking between her table and the entrance. They weren't looking out of concern for her. No, this was something else. The tension was subtle but sharp. One barista adjusted the placement of cups without purpose. Another polished a counter that was already spotless. Every so often, someone would check the time. The cafe door opened, and the quiet chime of the bell sent a ripple through the room. Heads turned, not toward Isabella, but toward the doorway. She didn't bother looking. She knew that sound meant nothing for her. It hadn't for years. She adjusted her scarf, a habit she'd picked up since the accident. It was a way to give her hands something to do when the silence around her became unbearable. Outside, the city bustled, cars honked. The hum of distant traffic pushed against the glass, and the occasional laugh from a passerby floated in. Inside, her world was still. Her phone buzzed once. She didn't look at it. It would be a calendar reminder or a pointless promotional message. Never what she wanted. Never someone saying, "Happy birthday, Bella. I'm on my way." She leaned back slightly, her gaze shifting to the street beyond the window. People hurried past without seeing her, the way people do when they sense someone else's sadness and are afraid it might stick to them. And then, almost imperceptibly, the staff's nervous energy sharpened. The door opened again, and this time there was a pause, long enough for Isabella to glance up. That was when she saw him. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with skin the color of polished mahogany, holding the hand of a little girl who clutched a small paper bag like it was a treasure. His eyes swept the cafe before landing on her. There was no hesitation, no flicker of discomfort at the sight of the wheelchair, just a calm, curious warmth that made the air shift. He walked toward her table. The little girl skipped alongside him, her braids bouncing. When they reached her, he spoke in a voice that was both gentle and sure. "Mind if we sit with you?" The words hung between them, startling in their simplicity. In a place where no one ever asked to share her table, they felt like a lifeline she hadn't known she needed. Isabella blinked, unsure whether to guard herself or let the moment in. Somewhere, just beneath the years of practiced detachment, something stirred. For a moment, Isabella wasn't sure if she'd heard him correctly. It had been so long since a stranger had addressed her without that thin veil of pity, or worse, that polite avoidance, that his question felt almost out of place. She glanced at the little girl first. Children were easier to read. The girl's eyes were wide and curious, but not in the way adults sometimes stared at her wheelchair. No, this was curiosity without judgment. The man waited patiently, one hand resting lightly on the back of the empty chair across from her. The faint aroma of his cologne, clean, warm, with a trace of cedar, mingled with the sharper scent of roasted coffee drifting through the cafe. "Sure," Isabella said softly, surprised at her own voice. It came out less guarded than she intended. He smiled, a real smile, not the half smirk she saw at business galas or charity luncheons, the kind that reached his eyes. He pulled out the chair for the little girl, who hopped up and immediately set the small paper bag on the table. "I'm Sophia," she announced, as though her name were the most important fact in the world. Then, pointing at the cupcake in front of Isabella, she asked, "Is it your birthday?" Isabella hesitated. Birthdays hadn't meant much to her in years, not since the accident, not since the dinners with friends had been replaced by quiet evenings alone in the penthouse. "Yes," she admitted at last. Sophia's face lit up. She rummaged in her bag and pulled out a slightly crumpled napkin with a small chocolate chip cookie inside. "Here, I got this from the counter. It's for you." The gesture was so unexpected, Isabella almost laughed. No one had given her anything today, not even a text. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. The man finally sat down. "I'm David," he said, extending a hand across the table. His grip was firm but not overpowering. "We were just about to grab a seat when I noticed you sitting alone. I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Isabella said. And strangely, she found she meant that too. For a while they just talked, or rather, Sophia talked, about her favorite ice cream flavor, about the stray cat that had started following them home, about how her dad burned pancakes, only sometimes. Isabella found herself smiling more than she had in months. David listened as much as he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried a quiet steadiness, the kind that made you feel as though every word mattered. He told her he worked in tech, teaching kids from underserved neighborhoods how to code. She could see the pride in the way Sophia looked at him while he spoke. Then, in a lull between conversations, David glanced at the untouched cupcake in front of her. "We should light that candle," he said gently. Isabella almost told him no, almost brushed it off with a joke about being too old for birthday wishes. But the look in Sophia's eyes stopped her. It was the look of someone who didn't see a lonely woman in a wheelchair, but just a person who deserved a song. David flagged down a barista who returned with a match. The flame flickered to life, reflecting in Isabella's eyes. And then, in the middle of that polished, self-conscious cafe, a man she'd just met and his little girl began to sing happy birthday to her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Heads turned. Some customers smiled. Others frowned in quiet disapproval, unsure why this stranger was breaking the unspoken rules of separation. But for Isabella, the sound of their voices washed over her like warm sunlight breaking through a long, cold shadow. She closed her eyes, made a wish she would never say out loud, and blew out the candle. What she didn't know was that this small, ordinary moment, this simple act of kindness, would set in motion a chain of events powerful enough to shatter everything she thought she knew about loyalty, family, and herself. The cupcake sat between them now, its pink frosting slightly smudged from Sophia's enthusiastic handling of the matchbox. Isabella had taken a single bite, not because she particularly liked cupcakes, but because refusing would have felt like rejecting the moment itself. Sophia swung her legs under the table, humming some tune only she seemed to know. David leaned back in his chair, studying Isabella with the kind of interest that wasn't invasive but carried the weight of genuine curiosity. She wasn't used to that. Usually, people looked at her as though her wheelchair was a wall that kept them from seeing her at all. "So," David began, "is this your usual birthday tradition? Quiet cafe, no one else around?" She smirked, the expression carrying just enough sarcasm to make him tilt his head. "You make it sound like I'm pitiful." "I didn't say that," he replied, smiling faintly. "But it doesn't seem like the kind of birthday you'd choose for yourself." Isabella stirred the foam in her untouched cappuccino. "Sometimes the parties you get aren't worth the effort of attending," she said, her tone lighter than the weight of her words. David's eyes softened. He didn't press, but she sensed he understood more than he let on. "What about you?" she asked. "Do you always wander into cafes rescuing lonely strangers on their birthdays?" He chuckled. "Not usually. But Sophia has a way of pulling me into situations I don't expect." Sophia grinned as if she knew exactly how true that was. "I saw your candle," she said matter-of-factly. "You looked like you needed someone to sing to you." The honesty in her voice was disarming. No filter, no agenda. Just a child's instinct for kindness. Isabella felt something shift, small, almost imperceptible, but real. They talked more after that. Isabella learned that David had been raising Sophia alone for 3 years since his wife's death. He'd left a high-paying job at a private tech firm to start a nonprofit teaching coding and digital skills to kids in neighborhoods often left behind. "It doesn't pay much," he admitted, "but it matters. And I want Sophia to grow up knowing that what you give is more important than what you keep." Isabella found herself watching him while he spoke, noticing the quiet conviction in his voice. There was no arrogance, no need to prove himself, so unlike the men she'd grown up around. When she spoke about her own life, she kept it vague. She didn't mention her last name or her father. She didn't talk about the boardrooms, the charity galas, the suffocating expectations. All she said was that she'd been an only child, that she used to work in business strategy before life took a turn, and that she was still figuring out what came next. David didn't pry. He just nodded, as though leaving space for her to decide what she wanted to share. The conversation slowed, and for a few seconds, they just sat there, listening to the low hum of the cafe. Then David glanced toward the door, his expression shifting. Isabella followed his gaze and saw the staff at the counter exchange a quick, nervous glance before straightening their posture. Something in the air changed. The door swung open, and in stepped a man whose presence seemed to rearrange the room. Tall, perfectly tailored suit, a watch that gleamed under the overhead lights. His eyes locked on Isabella like a hawk spotting prey. Her stomach tightened. "Isabella," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the air. David looked between them, reading the tension instantly. Sophia froze mid-swing of her legs. "Who's that?" Sophia whispered. Isabella's answer was quiet, almost reluctant. "My father." What happened next would turn the quiet corner of that cafe into the epicenter of a storm neither she nor David could have predicted. The sound of her father's voice was like the slam of a heavy door she'd thought she'd left open, cold, final, and echoing in her chest. Thomas Richardson moved toward their table with the slow precision of a man used to commanding every room he entered. Conversations at nearby tables dipped into uneasy murmurs. Even the barista's hand paused mid-pour. He stopped at the edge of the table, his gaze flicking briefly to David before settling on Isabella. It wasn't a greeting, it was an appraisal. "What exactly are you doing here?" His tone was calm in the way a storm cloud is calm before it bursts. Isabella felt her spine stiffen. She hated that, even after all these years, her body reacted before her mind could form words. "Having coffee," she said simply. "With them." His eyes slid to David, then to Sophia, and the unspoken them carried a weight that made Isabella's stomach turn. David didn't move, didn't flinch. "We were just keeping her company," he said evenly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to be loud to be heard. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I don't recall asking for your input." Sophia's little hand gripped the edge of the table. "We were singing Happy Birthday," she said, her voice soft but defiant in its innocence. Thomas's gaze softened momentarily when it landed on her, but the softness didn't last. He turned back to Isabella, lowering his voice to a hiss meant only for her. "You're making a scene. Again." Isabella felt the familiar burn in her chest, that mix of humiliation and fury she'd perfected hiding since childhood. But today, something in her refused to shrink. "The only scene here is you barging into a cafe to scold your daughter in public," she replied, her tone steady. The man at the table next to them angled his phone just enough to catch a recording. Someone else across the room tapped their screen. It wasn't loud, but in 2025 it didn't have to be. Thomas noticed. His jaw flexed, but instead of retreating, he leaned closer. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" "Yes," Isabella said. "For once, I do." The words landed harder than she expected. They made her father's eyes flash with something between anger and disbelief. She could feel David watching, his presence like an anchor keeping her from drifting into old habits of submission. "I'll have a car sent for you," Thomas said, straightening to his full height. "We'll talk at home." "I'm fine here," Isabella replied, not moving an inch. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze trying to strip away whatever armor she'd built in his absence. But this time, the armor held. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, the air in the cafe shifting in his wake. The bell above the door chimed as it closed behind him, and for a beat, no one moved. Then Sophia leaned forward, whispering as though she were sharing a secret. "He's scary." Isabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You're not wrong." David's voice was low, but it carried a note of warning she couldn't quite place. That wasn't just a concerned father. Isabella met his eyes, feeling the truth in his words even before she could name it. Somewhere deep inside, she knew. Her father's sudden appearance wasn't about coincidence. It was about control. And this small act of defiance, sitting here with David and Sophia, had just lit a fuse she might not be able to put out. It happened faster than Isabella could have imagined. By the time she rolled back into the quiet of her apartment later that afternoon, the cafe moment was already everywhere. The clip was barely 30 seconds long, just enough to capture Thomas Richardson's sharp tone, his cutting glance toward David, and the lingering silence that followed. The caption under the first post read, "CEO berates woman in wheelchair for sitting with strangers who sang her happy birthday." By nightfall, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Hashtags began multiplying like wildfire. Hashtag birthday with strangers, hash Richardson revealed, and the one that made her pulse quicken, dignity has no class. Her phone vibrated relentlessly, the screen lighting up with messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Some were supportive, others less so. She ignored them all. She didn't need to read the comments to know the internet had already divided into its usual factions, those who saw kindness and those who smelled blood. Across the city, David was getting his own wave of attention. His inbox filled with interview requests, sponsorship offers for his nonprofit, and a flood of thank you messages from strangers calling him a real gentleman. But tucked among the praise were darker notes, anonymous warnings, veiled threats, reminders to watch who you sit with. Sophia didn't understand it. "Why are people talking about us online?" she asked that evening, her small voice cutting through the static of David's thoughts. "Because," David said carefully, "sometimes people notice when you do something nice, and sometimes the wrong people notice too." In his penthouse office, Thomas Richardson was already in damage control mode. His crisis management team huddled around a glossy mahogany table, speaking in the clipped tones of people used to cleaning up scandals before they got messy. "It's nothing we can't manage," said Marcus Webb, his communications director. "We'll spin it, have a few influencers post about opportunists targeting you, shift the narrative." Thomas nodded once, his gaze cold. "And the man?" "David Williams," Marcus said, sliding a file across the table. "Former software engineer, runs a small nonprofit, widower. No significant wealth. He's clean. On paper." "Then dig deeper," Thomas ordered. "Everyone has a weakness. Find his." Meanwhile, in her bedroom, Isabella stared at the glowing screen of her laptop. She had seen public blow-ups before. Her father had been in the news more times than she could count, but this felt different. This wasn't a charity gala gone wrong or a questionable investment exposed. This was personal. She clicked open a folder hidden deep in her hard drive, years' worth of audio files, documents, scanned contracts. She had collected them quietly, methodically, while her father assumed she was just existing in the background, silent and unthreatening. Her finger hovered over the trackpad. It would be so easy to send the first file, to start the chain reaction she'd been preparing for, but she hesitated. David's face kept surfacing in her mind, the way he had looked at her in the cafe, not with pity, but with steady recognition. The way Sophia had placed that cookie in front of her like it was a priceless gift. Maybe this wasn't just her fight anymore. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual nighttime rhythm, sirens in the distance, car horns echoing off glass towers. Inside, Isabella leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. She knew the internet storm was only the first wave. The real damage, the kind that could dismantle a man like Thomas Richardson, would take more than a trending hashtag. And for the first time in years, she felt ready. The question now wasn't whether she'd act, it was how, and whether David Williams would still be standing beside her when the real war began. The penthouse was silent when Isabel awoke the next morning, but it was the kind of silence that felt staged, like the pause before a verdict. She rolled into the kitchen expecting to find her father already on his second coffee, scrolling through market reports. Instead, the marble counter gleamed empty, and on it sat a single envelope with her name written in her father's precise, slanted hand. She opened it slowly, her pulse quickening. Inside was no note, just a bank statement. Her personal accounts were empty. A second sheet listed security revisions, including the replacement of building access codes and the hiring of a personal safety team. In other words, prison bars dressed up as protection. When she found him in his office, he didn't even look up from his laptop. "It's for your own good," he said casually, as if they were discussing a diet plan. "You froze my accounts." "You've been reckless," he replied, tapping a key with deliberate slowness. "The internet hysteria will fade, but only if you stay out of sight. No interviews, no public appearances, and definitely no coffee dates with strangers." They weren't strangers. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles blanched. Thomas finally looked up, his expression flat. "Isabella, you don't seem to understand. Every move you make reflects on this family, and on me. That man saw an opportunity and took it. You're too trusting." Her laugh was short and sharp. "You mean he was kind to me, something you haven't been in years?" The flicker of irritation in his eyes was brief but telling. He closed his laptop with a snap. "I'm hiring new security. You won't be leaving without them. Until this blows over, your life will resume here, quietly." "You can't lock me up," she said, the words tasting foreign on her tongue because she already knew he could. "Yes," he said simply. "I can. And I will." She left before he could see her hands shake, not from fear but from the force it took to keep her temper in check. Inside her room, she shut the door and exhaled slowly. The familiar, suffocating walls of her childhood bedroom stared back at her. It was pristine, curated, as if she were a fragile exhibit rather than a daughter. But her father had made a mistake he'd been making for 2 years. When the accident had left her in this chair, he'd assumed she'd also lost her will to fight. He'd spoken in front of her like she wasn't there, held meetings in adjoining rooms with the doors wide open, discarded sensitive documents in the trash as if she couldn't reach them. He'd made her invisible in his world. And invisibility was the perfect camouflage. She rolled toward the wardrobe, sliding her hand along the back panel until it found the hidden latch. A soft click opened the narrow compartment where she'd stashed a slim laptop, one her father didn't know existed. Its matte black surface caught the light like a secret waiting to be told. By the time the penthouse settled into evening stillness, she was already connected to the secure network she'd built with activist friends and journalists. Her inbox was waiting, and among the unread messages was one name she'd been expecting. Alexandra Torres. Finally. "Are you ready to move?" Her father thought freezing her accounts would stop her. What he didn't know was that money wasn't the currency she'd been hoarding these past 2 years. She had something far more valuable, the truth. And she was done keeping it locked away. 2 years earlier, the world had been a different shape. The accident had shattered it, metal screaming against metal, glass raining down like shards of ice, the smell of gasoline searing her memory. When she woke in the hospital, her father had been there, his hand resting on the polished railing of her bed like it was the stock of a company he was considering acquiring. The pity in his eyes was practiced, not real, and beneath it she could already see the disappointment. The doctors called it a miracle that she'd survived. Her father called it an adjustment, but Isabella knew the truth. He saw her as damaged goods, a family liability. That shift happened fast. She stopped being invited to the glossy charity galas, the networking dinners, the carefully staged photo ops. She was still a Richardson, but no longer the kind he wanted on display. Instead, she was placed quietly at the edges, near enough to witness everything, far enough that no one thought to lower their voices. At first, she thought the snippets she overheard meant nothing. Numbers tossed around like poker chips, names she didn't recognize, talk of accelerating removals and land value adjustments. But over weeks, patterns emerged. The language was cold, calculated, the kind of language that didn't belong in a company built on philanthropy and community development. She started small. A misplaced memo slid into her purse. a casually discarded draft proposal tucked into a notebook. USB drives borrowed from conference rooms when no one was watching. No one suspected her. In their eyes, she was harmless, a broken ornament in the corner of the room. It was Alexandra Torres who taught her how to turn fragments into weapons. They'd met at a university lecture on disability rights where her father had been the keynote speaker, basking in applause for a speech she knew he hadn't written. Alexandra had been there covering the event for an investigative column. They struck up a conversation in the lobby, and Isabella, angry, impulsive, let something slip about the reality behind the polished speeches. Alexandra didn't flinch. She handed Isabella a card and said, "When you're ready to talk, really talk, call me." Months passed before Isabella did, but when she finally called, it was like opening a floodgate. Alexandra introduced her to people who could help. Ethical hackers, whistleblower lawyers, data analysts who could connect the dots between offshore accounts and forged contracts. Isabella became a ghost in her own home. She learned the art of being overlooked, eyes lowered, hands still, mouth shut. She could be in the room when her father and his executives mapped out entire neighborhoods for redevelopment, which really meant dismantling communities block by block. She listened to plans for manipulating government contracts, for buying politicians as casually as ordering lunch. Each time, she collected proof, scans, audio recordings from the miniature microphone hidden inside the clasp of her scarf, screenshots of emails she forwarded to encrypted accounts no one else could access. By the time the cafe incident happened 2 years later, she had enough evidence to sink Richardson Tech 10 times over. But evidence wasn't enough. She needed a way to release it without it being traced back to her before it was too late. She needed a public crack in her father's immaculate image, something that would make the world believe the rest of the story when it finally came out. She hadn't known what that moment would be, not until the man with the warm eyes and the little girl asked if they could sit at her table. That was when she felt it, the faint click of destiny falling into place. It started with little things, small enough that David might have brushed them off if they hadn't all happened so close together. The first was a polite but unexpected phone call from the HR director of a mid-sized tech firm where he'd been a finalist for a project lead position. They appreciated his interest, but after additional review, they had decided to go in a different direction. The email confirmation followed 10 minutes later, with no reason given. The second was stranger. His landlord, a usually easygoing man named Patel, knocked on his apartment door one evening looking uneasy. "David, I've been getting calls," he said, shifting from foot to foot. "Anonymous, asking about your financial stability, your background." David frowned. "What did you tell them?" "That you're a good tenant." "But," Patel hesitated. "One caller said they'd heard you were involved in unsavory business. Sounded like they wanted me to evict you." David forced a reassuring smile, but inside a knot began to form. By the third incident, it was impossible to ignore. Sophia came home from school unusually quiet, her backpack slipping from her shoulders as she climbed onto the couch. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" She looked down at her hands. "Some of the moms were whispering. One of them said you were trouble." The knot in David's stomach tightened. He crouched beside her. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes when people don't understand something, they make up stories." Her small voice cracked. "But why would they say that about you?" David didn't answer. He couldn't, not without telling her more than a 6-year-old should have to carry. That night, after Sophia was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, searching for any clue. The cafe video had made him briefly internet famous, but now the glow of positive attention was souring into something targe. Ted, personal. He knew how these things worked. This was no random wave of online trolling. Someone was pulling strings. He didn't have to guess who. When his phone buzzed, he expected another anonymous threat. Instead, the voice on the other end was calm, measured, and female. "Mr. Williams, my name is Alexandra Torres. I'm an investigative journalist. We need to talk about what happened at the cafe." "I'm not interested in talking to the press," David said, his tone sharper than intended. "I understand," Alexandra replied evenly, "but I'm not like the others. I have reason to believe your family is in real danger, and I know who's behind it." David went still. Go on. This isn't about a viral video, she said. It's about Thomas Richardson. And there's someone very close to him who's been preparing for this moment for years. There was a pause on the line, as if she were gauging whether he could handle the weight of what she was about to say. That someone, Alexandra continued, is your new friend, Isabella. David's mind flashed back to the cupcake, the candlelight, the unguarded smile she'd given Sophia. He thought of the brief shadow that had crossed her face when she'd introduced her father. I think it's time, Alexandra said softly, that you knew exactly who you sat with that day, and why she might have just put a target on your back. The cafe Alexandra chose for their meeting was nothing like the polished one where he'd first met Isabella. This place was tucked into a side street, its brick walls lined with shelves of mismatched books, the air scented with cinnamon and strong coffee. It was the kind of spot where people spoke in low voices and no one paid much attention to anyone else, a place for private conversations. David arrived early. He sat with his back to the wall, scanning the door. A habit he'd picked up since the birthday incident had turned his life into a slow-burn pressure cooker. Alexandra walked in right on time. She was in her late 30s with a confident stride and the sharp, watchful eyes of someone who saw more than people wanted her to. A leather satchel hung over one shoulder, worn at the edges from years of use. "Mr. Williams?" she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "David," he corrected. "Mr. Williams makes me sound like I should be wearing a suit." She smiled faintly but didn't waste time. From her bag she pulled out a slim folder, its edges thick with paper and printed photographs. "This is why I reached out," she said, pushing it toward him. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were documents, contracts, meeting transcripts, and a photo of Thomas Richardson standing in front of a construction site. At first it seemed ordinary, but then David saw the caption beneath the photo, detailing how the land had once belonged to a thriving black-owned community, until it had been bought out for a fraction of its worth. "They call it redevelopment," Alexandra said, her voice tight. "I call it engineered displacement, and Thomas Richardson has been doing it for years, targeting low-income, mostly minority neighborhoods, stripping them bare for profit." David flipped through the pages. The more he read, the heavier the pit in his stomach grew. "So where does Isabella fit into this?" Alexandra leaned forward. 2 years ago, after her accident, she started quietly collecting evidence. No one noticed because, well, they didn't see her anymore. She used that to her advantage. What she has now, emails, recordings, contracts, could take down her father and half the executives at Richardson Tech. David sat back, absorbing it. "And she wants me involved because she needs someone to authenticate the data and make sure it's bulletproof before it goes public," Alexandra said. "Your tech background, your nonprofit work, they make you credible. More importantly, you're outside her father's circle. He can't accuse you of being part of some corporate coup." David glanced toward the door, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "If Richardson's the kind of man you're describing, getting involved could put me and my daughter in even more danger." Alexandra didn't flinch. "You're already in danger, David. He's coming after you because he thinks you're close to her. Whether you help or not, he'll keep trying to crush you. The only way to stop him is to make sure he has no power left to use." Her words lingered in the space between them. David thought of Sophia, her small hand in his, her trust in him to keep her safe. He also thought of Isabella in the cafe, how she'd seemed so perfectly composed until her father walked in, and how quickly that composure had turned into a wall of steel. "What happens if we succeed?" he asked. Alexandra's expression was steady. "Then Thomas Richardson falls, and a lot of people who've been waiting for justice finally get it." David looked down at the folder again. Somewhere deep inside, a decision began to take shape. A dangerous one, but one that felt like the only option. He closed the folder and slid it back toward her. "Tell me what you need me to do." It was well past midnight when David's laptop chimed with a new email. He had been sitting at his kitchen table for hours, the only light coming from the screen and the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Sophia had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up on the couch with her favorite blanket, the quiet rise and fall of her breathing a fragile reminder of why he had to tread carefully. The sender's name made his chest tighten. Isabella R. The subject line was short. We need to talk. But the email body was encrypted. At the bottom, a single sentence. This is secure. Please use the attached key to open the file. David hesitated only a moment before following the instructions. The encrypted message bloomed onto his screen, lines of clean text against a black background. David, I know Alexandra has told you some of it. I want you to hear the rest from me. My father's reach is deeper than you think. He's not just trying to scare you, he's trying to ruin you. You're a risk to him now, even if you don't want to be. For the last 2 years, I've been collecting evidence of his corruption. I have everything, emails, contracts, audio recordings, offshore account records, enough to make sure he never sees another day of freedom. But it's not enough to have the truth. It has to be impossible to deny. That's where you come in. I need someone who can verify the data, authenticate it in a way that no court, no news outlet, no politician can discredit. You have the skills, you have the credibility, and whether you like it or not, you're already in this. If you say yes, I'll send you the first batch of files within 24 hours. If you say no, I'll understand. But I can't promise my father will leave you alone. Isabella. David read the message twice, the words sinking in like slow-moving ink. He thought about the past week, the job rejections, the phone calls to his landlord, the whist home, pers at Sophia's school. She was right. He was already in it. He typed his reply carefully. Send me the files. The first batch arrived the next day. It wasn't just a few damning documents, it was an avalanche. Zip folders filled with PDF scans of contracts, spreadsheets mapping money transfers to shell companies, audio clips in which Thomas Richardson's voice was unmistakable. One recording in particular stopped David cold. He recognized the tone instantly, the same cold, calculated precision he'd heard in the cafe. These people don't know the real value of the land. Offer them crumbs, they'll take it. Then we make millions. David sat back in his chair, his pulse loud in his ears. The casual cruelty of it was staggering. He spent the next 48 hours working through the files, checking metadata, running verification tools, cross-referencing timestamps and email headers. Everything was real, and everything was damning. Late on the second night, he sent Isabella a secure message. It's solid, every last bit of it. If we release this, there's no going back. Her reply came almost immediately. I'm not going back. Neither should you. David closed his laptop, the decision now carved into stone. They weren't just gathering evidence anymore, they were sharpening it into a weapon. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse lined with glass and steel, Thomas Richardson had no idea that his own daughter and the man he'd dismissed as inferior were preparing the first strike. And when it landed, there would be no safe place for him to hide. The expose went live at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. David was awake before dawn, the glow of his laptop painting the kitchen in cold light. Sophia was still asleep in her room, curled around her stuffed rabbit, blissfully unaware that her father was about to help set a fire he could never put out. Isabella had insisted on timing the release for maximum impact, early enough to dominate the morning news cycle, late enough that the story couldn't be buried before the financial markets opened. The headline on the largest investigative news site in the country was brutal and impossible to ignore. Empire of Hypocrisy: How Philanthropist Thomas Richardson Built His Fortune on the Ruins of Black Communities. Below it, a high-resolution photo of Thomas at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, smiling for the cameras, was paired with an audio waveform and a transcript. These people don't know the real value of the land. Offer them crumbs, they'll take it. Then we make millions. David scrolled slowly. Every document, every screenshot, every contract had been authenticated. Metadata intact, timestamps aligned. The article was a meticulous, devastating autopsy of Thomas Richardson's career. Government contracts awarded through manipulated bidding processes. Shell companies used to funnel kickbacks to city inspectors. Neighborhoods targeted for redevelopment through aggressive gentrification tactics, forcing families from their homes for pennies on the dollar. There were photographs of families standing in front of bulldozed lots, timelines showing how property values had been artificially deflated before Richardson Tech moved in, and internal emails where executives openly discussed removing longtime residents. The reaction was instant. By 6:30 a.m., the story was trending on every major social media platform. By 7:15, cable news anchors were reading excerpts live on air, their voice is tight with shock and outrage. At 8:02, the stock ticker for Richardson Tech began its freefall. In his penthouse office, Thomas stared at the headline on his tablet, the color draining from his face. Marcus Webb, his communications director, stood frozen in the doorway, his phone pressed to his ear. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice low and dangerous, "tell me you can contain this." Marcus hesitated. Too long. "Sir, the evidence is too strong. Every outlet is running it. They've even uploaded the original files for public download." Thomas's hands tightened into fists. "Who did this?" Marcus swallowed hard. "We're still trying to trace the source, but whoever it is, they've been collecting this for years." Across the city, in a quiet apartment, David's phone lit up with a new secure message from Isabella. "It's done, and it's only the beginning." By mid-morning, government agencies had announced formal investigations. City Hall issued a statement distancing itself from Richardson Tech. Protesters gathered outside the company's headquarters, holding signs that read, "Dignity has no price," and "Give back what you stole." And in living rooms and offices across the country, people who had once admired Thomas Richardson were replaying his voice, cold, smug, undeniable, over and over again. Isabella had told David there would be no going back once the truth was out. She was right. For Thomas Richardson, the empire he'd built over decades had begun to crumble in a matter of hours. And this was only day one. Thomas found her in the sunlit sitting room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the Italian marble that gleamed like ice. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella. He always chose this room for confrontations. Here, the light was brutal, revealing every line, every twitch, every tell. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. His presence entered before he did, a wave of controlled fury that seemed to darken the air. "You." His voice was low, but it was the kind of low that vibrated, like the growl of an engine about to redline. Isabella didn't look up right away. She took a deliberate sip of tea, setting the cup down with quiet precision before meeting his eyes. "Good morning, Dad." "Don't you dad me." His jaw was rigid, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" She tilted her head slightly as if considering the question. "Yes, I told the truth." "Truth?" He barked out a laugh, sharp and humorless. "You've destroyed this family's reputation. You've destroyed me. Contracts are frozen. Investors are pulling out. The board is in chaos. Do you think this makes you a hero?" "I think it makes me honest," she said evenly. "Something you've never been." The vein in his temple throbbed. "You've been plotting this, haven't you? For years, sitting there in your chair pretending to be invisible while you—" "Listened?" she interrupted softly. "Yes, I listened. To every meeting you held with the door half closed. To every phone call where you thought I wasn't paying attention. You made me invisible, Dad. That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking invisibility meant powerlessness." He took a step closer, the muscles in his shoulders tightening. "You think this will end well for you? That people will see you as some kind of savior? The moment the dust settles, they'll turn on you. And when they do, I won't be there to protect you." "You were never there to protect me," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "Not after the accident, not after you decided a daughter in a wheelchair didn't fit the image you wanted. The only thing you've ever protected is your bottom line." His eyes narrowed to slits. "You've been working with that man, the one from the cafe. Williams." "David," she said, letting the name hang in the air like a challenge. "Yes, he authenticated the evidence. He made sure every document, every recording, every transfer you tried to hide was bulletproof. And Alexandra Torres made sure it reached every person who needed to see it." For a moment he didn't speak. The realization settled over him like a slow, poisonous fog. This wasn't some impulsive betrayal. This was an execution, planned with precision, carried out flawlessly. You've ruined everything, he said finally, his voice a low rasp. No, Isabella replied, her gaze steady. I've saved what can be saved. The rest needed to burn. His phone began to buzz in his pocket, urgent, insistent. He ignored it. You're my daughter, he said almost to himself, and you've done this to me. She leaned forward slightly, her tone cutting through the room like glass. I'm your daughter because I share your name, not your values, and you did this to yourself. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens began to rise, faint at first but growing louder. Thomas's eyes flickered toward the window. Isabella didn't look away from him once. Who's that? He asked, though they both knew. The beginning of the end, she said softly. And as the wail of the sirens closed in, Thomas Richardson finally understood. His empire wasn't crumbling because of some external enemy. It was falling because the person he'd underestimated most had dismantled it from the inside. The pounding on the front door was like a drumbeat announcing the inevitable. Heavy, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Thomas froze for the briefest moment, just long enough for Isabella to see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Then the voice came, clear and authoritative through the glass. Federal agents, open the door. He straightened his tie with mechanical precision, as if adjusting his appearance could somehow undo the reality about to break through the threshold. But his hands trembled, just enough for Isabella to notice. Two uniformed security men, his so-called personal safety team, hurried in from the hallway. Sir, we need to stand down, Thomas snapped. It's a misunderstanding. Another round of knocks, louder, sharper. Mr. Richardson, we have a warrant. Open the door or we will enter by force. Thomas's jaw clenched. For all his posturing, he knew they meant it. With a sharp motion, he gestured for the guards to unlock the door. It swung open and the room filled with movement. Black tactical vests, clipped voices, the rustle of papers being handed over. The lead agent, a tall woman with piercing gray eyes, stepped forward. Thomas Richardson, she said, her tone formal but unyielding. You are under arrest for racketeering, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government. Gasps erupted from the household staff gathered at the edge of the room. Phones were discreetly raised, thumbs tapping. Even here in his own home, Thomas couldn't control the narrative anymore. I have lawyers, he said, his voice tight. You'll need them, the agent replied flatly. Two other agents moved in, reading him his rights as they guided his hands behind his back and snapped on the cuffs. The metallic click seemed to echo through the marble and glass room, bouncing off every surface like a final judgment. Through it all, Isabella sat perfectly still in her wheelchair, her expression unreadable. But inside, she felt the weight of the moment, the years of silence, of watching, of collecting, all crystallizing into this one irreversible point in time. Thomas's eyes found hers as they began to lead him away. You think this is over? He said, his voice a strained rasp. She met his gaze without flinching. No, this is where it starts. As they escorted him through the doorway, the flashing lights from the street spilled into the foyer, red and blue reflections scattering across the polished marble. Outside, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the sirens and the spectacle. Reporters were already shouting questions. Mr. Richardson, do you have a statement? Is it true your daughter leaked the evidence? Will you step down from Richardson Tech? He ignored them all, keeping his chin high as he was loaded into the waiting black SUV. But the cameras caught every second. The image of Thomas Richardson, hands cuffed, flanked by federal agents, was already on its way to becoming the defining photograph of his legacy. Back inside, the house was quieter than it had been in years. Isabella wheeled herself toward the window, watching the motorcade disappear down the street. She let out a slow breath. This wasn't victory yet, not fully, but it was the first undeniable blow. And there would be more. The boardroom smelled of tension and expensive cologne. Every seat at the long, glossy mahogany table was filled, executives in tailored suits, faces pale and tight. Some avoided looking at Isabella as she wheeled in, others stared outright, as if still trying to reconcile the image of the woman they'd once dismissed with the reality of the person who had just toppled their king. The leather chair at the head of the table sat empty, Thomas's chair. The chairman of the board, a thin man named Harlan Boyd, cleared his throat. "Let's come to order." His voice cracked slightly before he steadied it. "Given recent developments, we must address leadership succession immediately." Murmurs rippled around the table. They all knew the truth. Richardson Tech was bleeding. Stock prices had cratered, contracts had been suspended, and public trust was circling the drain. But amid the wreckage, a strange consensus had begun to form. The only person who could salvage what was left was the one who had started the fire. Harlan's gaze landed on her. "Ms. Richardson, the board is prepared to offer you the role of interim CEO, effective immediately." Isabella let the silence breathe before answering. "Interim?" A few people shifted uncomfortably. "Prove you can stabilize the company," Harlan said, "and the role becomes permanent." She nodded slowly. "Then let's be clear. Stability isn't my goal. Integrity is. If you want me in this chair, understand that Richardson Tech will not be the same company in 6 months. Not even close." Her tone was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had already decided what needed to be done. She took the seat at the head of the table, her wheelchair fitting neatly behind it, and pulled a folder from her bag. "First order of business," she said, flipping it open. "We're ending all pending redevelopment projects that target low-income neighborhoods effective today, and we will begin a process to return any properties acquired through coercion or under-market buyouts." A few executives protested at once. "That's millions in losses." "That's reparations," Isabella cut in sharply. "Losses are what you take when you stop stealing." The room went still. "Second," she continued, "we are creating a $15 million community investment fund focused on affordable housing, small business grants, and education programs in the neighborhoods this company harmed. It will be overseen by an independent committee, not by corporate leadership." A woman at the far end of the table adjusted her glasses. "And who exactly will lead this committee?" Isabella didn't hesitate. "David Williams. Effective immediately. He is our new Director of Social Responsibility." The name hung in the air. A few exchanged glances. They'd all seen the video, the cafe incident, the man with the little girl who had unwittingly started this chain of events. "He understands what this company never has," Isabella said, her voice steady. "That dignity matters more than profit margins." She moved on, laying out the framework for transparency reforms, whistleblower protections, and a complete audit of corporate practices. With each point, she dismantled the machine her father had built, replacing it with something entirely new. By the time the meeting adjourned, she could see it in their eyes. Some were wary, some outright resentful, but a few looked almost relieved. As the board members filed out, Harlan lingered by the door. "You know," he said quietly, "your father would call this destroying his life's work." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then I guess I'm saving what's left of it." When the room was empty, Isabella turned her chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out before her, sprawling and imperfect. Somewhere out there, David was probably explaining to Sophia that he'd just accepted a new job. For the first time in years, the "we" in her chest felt lighter. Her father's empire had been built on taking. Hers would be built on giving. And she was just getting started. 2 years later, the air smelled faintly of lilacs and polished wood as sunlight spilled through the tall, arched windows of the community conservatory. It was a building with history, once an abandoned property taken illegally by Richardson Tech during her father's reign, now transformed into a place filled with music, laughter, and the low hum of possibility. The conservatory was alive. The main hall had been cleared of chairs except for neat rows on either side of a wide aisle draped in white petals. Isabella sat near the entrance in her wheelchair, her hands resting loosely in her lap. For a moment she let herself simply take it in. The murmur of voices, the shimmer of strings being tuned in the background, the scent of fresh flowers weaving through the air. She was wearing a dress of soft ivory satin, the fabric flowing around her legs in gentle folds. The neckline was simple, elegant, and her hair was gathered in a loose knot, with a single strand falling over her cheek. She wasn't one for grand displays, but today was different. At the far end of the hall, Sophia stood proudly in her pale blue dress, clutching a basket of petals. She had grown taller, her features sharper, but her eyes still held the same bright openness Isabella had first seen in the cafe that day. The little girl who once offered her a cookie now looked like she belonged here, in this moment, as much as anyone. Music swelled, a warm, lilting melody played by the children of the conservatory, many of whom had been given instruments and lessons through the programs she and David had built. The sound was imperfect in the way only real music could be, full of heart. Then David appeared. He stood at the end of the aisle, wearing a dark suit that fit him perfectly, but did nothing to hide the quiet sincerity in his expression. His eyes found hers immediately, and the room seemed to blur, the chatter fading into a hush. When he began walking toward her, Sophia skipped ahead, scattering petals with a precision that made the guests smile. Isabella felt her chest tighten, not with nerves but with the overwhelming realization of what they'd built together, not just this day but everything that had led here. When he reached her, David didn't look at the crowd or the officiant. He looked only at her. "Ready?" he asked softly. She smiled. "I've been ready for a long time." The ceremony was simple, stripped of pretense. They stood together at the front, her chair positioned so they were eye to eye, and exchanged vows that weren't about promises of perfection, but about choosing each other in every imperfect day to come. When it was her turn to speak, Isabella's voice was steady, but the emotion in it ran deep. 3 years ago, my father told me I would never be anything but a weight dragging this family down. Today, I run a company worth $2 billion. I am marrying the most honest man I've ever known, and I have a daughter who teaches me every day that love knows no barriers. She glanced toward Sophia, who beamed from her seat. Sometimes, the people who try the hardest to tear us down are the ones who push us to rise the highest. The applause was warm, unforced. When they kissed, it wasn't the dramatic flourish of a fairy tale. It was quiet, sure, and real. The kind of kiss that carried the weight of everything they had survived, and the promise of everything still to come. As the guests filtered out into the courtyard, children's laughter mixing with the sound of violins, Isabella caught sight of the small plaque by the main entrance. It read, "Table of Kindness, in memory of a birthday shared by strangers who became family." She smiled. The story had come full circle, but in truth it was only beginning. The conservatory was quiet that afternoon, sunlight streaming through the tall windows and pooling across the polished wooden floors. Most of the students had gone home, their laughter still lingering faintly in the hallways. Isabella was in her office, sorting through end-of-year program reports, when one of the staff members knocked gently on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "He says his name is Thomas Richardson." For a heartbeat, Isabella didn't move. It had been 5 years since she'd last seen her father in person, the day he was led out of their home in handcuffs. She knew he'd been released from prison a few weeks ago, but she hadn't expected him here. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Bring him in," she said finally. When he entered, she almost didn't recognize him. The sharp, commanding presence he'd once carried was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier. His hair was fully gray now, his suit simple and worn at the cuffs. The weight he'd lost in prison hadn't returned. For a moment, they just looked at each other. "I didn't come to fight," Thomas said, his voice rougher than she remembered. "I just wanted to see where you've been spending your life." She studied him for signs of the man she had once feared, and in some complicated way, still loved. "This is where the work happens," she said. "Real work. Work that gives back instead of taking away." Thomas's gaze moved around the office, taking in the framed photographs, children holding instruments, community events, families smiling in front of newly built homes. His eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. "I heard Sophia's playing in the recital today," he said. "She is," Isabella replied. "She's gotten good." They walked together, slowly, awkwardly, into the main rehearsal hall. The sound of a violin filled the air, warm and rich. At the far end, Sophia stood on the small stage, bow moving gracefully across the strings, her eyes closed in concentration. She didn't notice them until she finished the last note. Looking up, she tilted her head. "Are you Bella's dad?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "I am. And you must be Sophia." She smiled, unbothered by the history she didn't fully know. "Do you want to hear my song for the recital?" "I'd like that very much," he said quietly. Sophia began to play again, the melody simple but full of heart. Thomas stood still, the music wrapping around him, loosening something he hadn't even realized he'd been holding on to. He glanced at Isabella, who was watching from the side, her arms loosely folded. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't closed off either. When the song ended, Sophia lowered her violin. "Bella says music can fix broken things," she said. "Do you think that's true?" Thomas's voice caught, but he managed, I'm starting to." For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about power, money, or control. He was just a man listening to a child's song in a room filled with light. And as he stood there, he finally understood the lesson Isabella had been trying to teach him all along. True power doesn't come from tearing people down. It comes from lifting them up. In that moment, he realized his daughter had taken the legacy he had poisoned and transformed it into something enduring, something beautiful. And she had done it without him. "Thank you," he murmured. Though whether it was to Sophia, to Isabella, or to the music itself, even he couldn't say.